And here we are again. I'm
Hey,
Jen Roselli.
I'm Kyle Godby, and what is these again? These are our field notes from the swamp.
We're
That's where
doing
we've
great.
been.
We're doing great.
Off to a good start. Um, Still heavy on the decongestants,
Good
if you
excuse.
can't tell. So a little foggy, but that might make for some interesting wanderings today. Um, so we were starting to talk about Bill Nye, the complexity guy, who this came up a couple of years ago when we first met, when we were at the Knevin retreat, and we were kind of musing, how do we get from this very heady sort of philosophical language, this very academic language, to something that is much more elementary and not just conversational, certainly not dumbed down, but something that can get kids excited and can get people just interested. And what I was saying before when we were talking was like, my kids don't know anything. My kids are 6 and 4. They don't know anything about astrophysics. They don't know anything about rocket science, but they're really, really interested in space and rockets. We've got the Legos all over. We turn on the flashy Netflix documentaries every once in a while, and they just like gush over this sort of stuff. We flip
Yeah.
through books all the time, and I don't have to sit down and explain gravity to them. They're not there yet. It's contextualized at their level that this stuff's cool.
Yeah. Yet. And at their
Yes,
level.
that
Because
yeah,
a little bit we've talked
exactly.
about this. And listeners, we were talking about this right before we got on, which is why we were like, we should just start recording.
Mm-hmm.
I always get like really itchy about this topic too. So like I'm kind of like, okay, this is not but it's a sort of a yes and, but it's also here's why I get uncomfortable with a lot. But okay, so at the end of the day, I fucking love Bill Nye. I taught high school
Mm-hmm.
physics. I showed Bill Nye videos to AP physics 12th graders because even though the ideas that he was communicating were, made for kids, young kids, or young at heart, because even I
Mm-hmm.
loved and continue to love Bill Nye. They were really good to help even advanced physics students think about how to communicate the ideas because communicating is important regardless of what you're doing, but also because it was a good prompt sometimes to ask, okay, what is he talking about compared to what you now know to be true? It was a good opportunity to circle back to this notion of this on ramp, or as you're saying, your kids don't understand gravity yet, but they are excited. And I feel like the yet is so important because if they were
Mm-hmm.
going to pursue a deeper knowledge of science, they would continue to add, maybe additive isn't right. We don't want to focus always on additive, but they would continue to shape and evolve and change and morph their understanding to fill in the richness. I often think about pixels, in the olden
Mm-hmm.
days of the internet, loading
Sure.
an image, you'd get the super pixelated, low resolution image, and slowly it would fill in. It's not that it's adding the image over time in pieces and pieces. It was blurry and pixelated, and then it would slowly add resolution and pixels until it was a much higher resolution and higher quality image. So to
Yeah.
me, gaining knowledge and insight and understanding and learning is a lot more like that. And so where I get itchy on this is because I think a lot of people forget the yet, or the implication that there is a more rich or rigorous understanding yet to be had. So when anytime who's the Bill Nye of complexity science, or who is going to be, or we need a Bill Nye of complexity science, like I think we need that. But
Mm-hmm.
at the very same time, I get scared about the idea because anybody who I think makes it their explicit goal to be a Bill Nye of complexity science risks, by the nature of the science, doing the things you just said, water it down or dumb it down, or, kind of lose. How do you
Right.
like how do you like go at a lower resolution picture enough that the whole point of complexity is it's that right level of granularity. So I've said
Yeah.
nothing coherent in this opening bit other than I love Bill Nye. I
Mm-hmm.
also love Alton Brown. I was talking about him earlier as a
Right.
parallel idea. For those who aren't familiar, cooking show guy. Alton Brown was on Food Network for many years, had a show called Good Eats, and it was like the Bill Nye of cooking. Talked a lot about cooking science in a way that was very accessible, made science feel, understandable in a way that helped you understand what was going on in the actual chemistry of what you're doing and your choices about how you cook. And probably is a good
Mm-hmm.
example of how to take someone from being a recipe follower to an
Mm-hmm.
actual chef or home cook who can, do things in the style of ye old complexity
Yeah.
metaphor. So I love these people, and I think we need that for complexity science. But I also see the danger in when we Bill Nyeify something, what we lose. I have more to say, but I'm going to shut up for a minute.
No, that's the right, I think, concern to have. It's also like I grew up on. Do you remember Mr. Wizard? I know
Yes.
I'm a couple years older, but yeah, okay, good. So Mr.
And
Wizard,
three, two,
and for
one
everyone
contact and the electric company
in
and
the
all of
electrical,
those.
yeah,
Yeah.
yep.
And
Mr.
I
Wizard was my thing though. That was
yeah.
the one. Um,
Yep.
and for everyone a little too young or too old to remember, like this was a niche thing that ran for just a couple of years. So you have to be in this like Xennial sweet spot to really know Mr. Wizard, I think.
Yeah.
But the format was the same every episode. It was this old neighborhood guy, and people would just stop by. Kids would stop by, and he would have basically like quick experiments already set up in his kitchen, and they would look at like water displacement,
Yep.
or they would look at peristalsis in a simple like here. I remember like here, do a headstand and eat this apple. I remember them watching ice melt in glasses to do water displacement and simple stuff like that. Um, it you can still kind of absorb that and go, okay, that's how the world works. I get it now. And then walk away and never pursue science any further. Go be a lawyer and not have any interest in science, but still have a better understanding of how the world around you works immediately and still gain some benefit from that. And so the yet is good. If the curiosity compels you, the yet needs to be there. But that if is an important component. So it's still, I think somehow, because you're right, it can't be watered down, it can't be dumbed down. It needs to be, and this is where I guess when I say contextualize, it needs to be relevant, and to the point that it can have a period at the end of it, and say that can be the end of this chapter. It doesn't. If it creates more questions, there's another chapter. If it doesn't, you can close the book and move on and go play sports or go learn music or a different science. Also, go into earth science and hope that complexity doesn't intersect with that somewhere.
So I
Obviously,
would
that's
I
up to you.
would definitely agree that I don't think people would say the goal of Mr. Wizard or Bill Nye um, is that people watch and then want to major in those areas or go into
Mm-hmm.
those fields. However, what do you think the actual intention or goal of those things is or should be for the people who engage with them? What do you feel like
Um,
they should accomplish? And I'm not asking you to like talk about what you think the show creator, like for you,
yeah,
Kyle, what is like the desirable impact of Mr. Wizard or Bill Nye on the people
I,
that
I
watch?
I think there's a couple different things. I think one of them, and I've heard, oh, why am I forgetting his name? Reading Rainbow.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
LeVar Burton.
LeVar Burton, thank you. So I've heard
Brilliant.
Lamar Burton talk about this a few times, and he's another like
Yeah.
another amazing one. Um, it wasn't necessarily to share the literature. It was to just say books are cool and like reading is good and like being curious is great. And like for
You could
everyone
say,
that is, hmm?
keep going.
Like for that's kind of where I see these things is for people that are curious and asking questions, that there is a place for that. Um, the what's his name, Pee Wee Herman, the interview with him where he's talking about like the Pee Wee's Playhouse was just a setup for like kids that want to be weird. There's a place for you. There's like a place to have fun and be weird also. Like I think that's a good objective, not necessarily to say like it needs to capitalize any further than that to say, there's just value in learning and curiosity, and here's an outlet for that, or here's a supply for that.
You've just given every possible answer. I want you to pick one. No, I'm just kidding. The reason I asked, okay, because you started to get into it. I mean, is it an outlet or is it a supply? I mean, it's both. It's all these things. But
Yeah.
Curiosity is what I wanted to zero in on, because you had said something earlier and then I wanted to hear you expand more on it. So is it to spark and generate curiosity and to help people become more curious about their world, regardless of where they might go on to point their curiosity? Is it to give people who are already naturally curious a place to extend their curiosity? I heard you say some variation of these, and part of why I wanted to ask, I have things I want to get to, so I wrote them down, but I have to follow this rabbit hole, because I hear an implication and I want to find out if it's actually how you feel. The curiosity is something you already have that you bring to this, to an engagement with one of these, and they're an outlet and a support for you. If you're the kind of person who's curious, it's important to have things like this. Or is it to generate and build curiosity in people?
I think that's the right way to put it.
Either or. Like, I know you and I don't believe in like that, but I'd like to hear more about that.
Well, no, you're right. It's not either or, but I think the generating is a big piece of it. Like, I remember when we I don't know, there was a rocket launch when we put our moon probe up maybe 3 years ago or so. And it happened at like 8 o'clock in the morning, which is just when we're doing our morning ritual. I was able to stream that for the kids. They'd never seen anything like that before. They had no idea what was going on. And then they ran around the house for the next like hour before we got out the door screaming, "We're going to the moon." And they're like flying their toys around and that kind of stuff. That was generative. Just watching that was incredibly generative. Cool. And it created a lot more questions, and it's created questions since, and those questions have all snowballed. So I think generative is the right way to approach it. Now, I think the questions that Bill Nye, the complexity guy, would answer are questions that are, I don't want to say intuitive or intrinsic, but maybe. But I don't know that they'd necessarily get funneled into this space intentionally. And so I think that's more of a byproduct. So yeah, generative is what I'm going to go with. Okay. What are you thinking?
Yeah. So, I mean, at this point, this is even beyond tangential, but I find this very interesting. And I have spent a lot of like parts of my life and career on some things that are adjacent, which is why I can't help this. But so I think about curiosity and people and you, and we've talked about this before, but like people have heard me say that, right? Like the curiosity is something I think everybody's born with. It's part of being a creature that evolves and lives in the world. And if we weren't curious to some extent, we wouldn't learn, and then we wouldn't survive, and we wouldn't evolve and whatever. So maybe it's more about stoking it, would be the way I would probably imagine. Like if curiosity is already there in all of us, but in some of us, to use a like hackneyed fire metaphor, for some it might be just barely glowing embers, and for others it might be a raging fire. And so, to what extent is your role as a parent to stoke that curiosity and to do the things that Bill Nye and Alton Brown and LeVar Burton do, is to help keep stoking that fire and keeping it alive and helping that fire be something that continues to generate, and autopoiesis and all that, right? So I feel like you and I are very much on the same wavelength about the role of these. And the reason I wanted to hear more about how you thought about it as far as outcomes is because this helps stoke curiosity, which is I would say, valuable, helpful thing for anybody in any capacity in anything they're doing. So even if you're stoking someone's curiosity about science in this show, but they don't want to actually go on and do anything science related, but their curiosity having been stoked will serve them in other ways.
Right.
That I think is so noble and so core to like human interaction. Like that in and of itself needs no additional defense or advocacy. I mean, I'm sure it does to some people, but like not around here. Where it starts to make this leap is with complexity science, We always
Mm-hmm.
talk so much, and you just made this point about how a lot about engaging with complex systems is actually something that is innate, because we do move through a world of complex adaptive systems, regardless of whether we've ever heard of the field of complexity science. So something like a complexity science Bill Nye kind of almost feels like it has to do something fundamentally different from regular Bill Nye, who is explaining things that are actually not all that intuitive to people.
Yeah.
And you said earlier that, like, your kids love science and love rockets. They don't know, like Newton's laws of gravity or anything.
Mm-hmm.
They have Legos. They're at Lego level understanding.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like the issues around complexity science and complexity science informed practices or decision making is the kind of stuff that needs a richer picture, a higher resolution picture, more rigor than just the Lego level understanding. I imagine you agree. You can totally disagree with me in a second, but I suspect you're like, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
we're talking about two different things here. The challenge is, I think, mixing up the two. So when you see
Mm-hmm.
people who are out there in the world, authors, LinkedIn influencers, whoever, who are kind of either subtly trying or just overtly trying to become the Bill Nyes of complexity science, they are mixing up what I think are two things we need to be careful about. And one is the stoking of the curiosity, the welcoming of folks who want to just poke around at this stuff and engage with it in a way that could be fundamentally generative and useful for a human to stoke that curiosity, as opposed to building some level of richer understanding and rigorous knowledge and, capability that is more than just Legos. And I think the mixing up of those two continues to be, and maybe will indefinitely be, this kind of inherent challenge with the field of complexity, because of the nature of complexity itself feeling like we all already were born with the Lego level, and now when you see somebody trying to kind of, well, the one thing I wrote down, I have a little note here. I just literally wrote learning versus explaining. And it's partly
Mm-hmm.
because when you think about Mr. Wizard, you think about
Mm-hmm.
Bill Nye, you think about Alton Brown, what makes them so good at their craft here is that they are facilitating you learning, and they're
Right.
stoking your curiosity. They're not just explaining. And if you just said it quickly and said Alton Brown's awesome because he explains food science in ways that I understand, and Bill Nye's awesome because he explains science in ways I
Mm-hmm.
understand, it's fine. I would excuse that. But what they're doing is not just explaining, because if that's all they did,
Right.
they wouldn't be famous and they wouldn't be anywhere near as effective. Right?
Right.
They are, you said it, in the Mr. Wizard shows, it was like a cooking show, because you would come in
Mm-hmm.
with some scaffolding already there to build into that zone of proximal development, and like take you through where you can start and hold your hand for the part you can't do on your own, so that things
Mm-hmm.
click and things fall into place and you're engaged and you have an encounter with difference, which we'll come back to that later. But like that's kind of what gets me on this topic, is I want so deeply for there to be someone in the world who is doing the Lord's work as a complexity science Bill Nye. And I also know with just as much conviction, if anybody ever really actually tries to be that, they will never be able to achieve it, because A, sticking your neck out to do that is going to get you shot by all the number of people out there who are going to say you're doing it wrong. And B, it almost feels like a weird kind of double bind situation where you get stuck in explaining and you can't actually facilitate the learning, because the thing that you're trying to explain is technically something that is so innate someone already knows it, or it's so advanced that you can't be doing the Bill Nye version of it.
Yes.
I don't know where we go from here.
No, I've got a few things.
Good.
Because like what you were saying, in its own way, Bill Nye and Mr. It's all participatory. And this is how we explain complexity to adults. We don't preach at them. We will for people that are like, I'm coming to this because I want to hear more about it because I'm interested.
Like
But
we're doing
people
right
that
now.
aren't actively, exactly, people that aren't actively coming up to us and saying, "Can you tell me something about complexity?" The people are stakeholders and clients. We are facilitating some conversation that allows them to have the oh shit moment of, wait, there's plurality in this space. I wasn't expecting that, or I didn't agree. They have those, like the bottom drops out a little bit, and they have to kind of sit back, which is the same thing as the ice melting in Mr. Wizard's kitchen. It's I'm experiencing this firsthand, and now I'm connecting the dots as to why this works and how it's relevant to my life. So somebody, I'm gonna do it. We don't do it explicitly. We don't sit down and say we're getting in complexity science circles. Let's start talking so we can learn in complexity science here. We have anecdote circles. We do narrative research. We do all sorts of different things in this, driven by this, but we don't necessarily say, for the sake of learning what a complex adaptive system is. So the one place I can think of off the top of my head, and I'm sure there are a few more out there, everyone's going to get sick of hearing me talk about Bluey at some point, but Bluey is doing this in such a brilliant way with kids. For everyone in our audience that has not watched Bluey yet, go watch Bluey. It's on Disney Plus. I'm not paid. We're not sponsored by Disney. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, let's send them an invoice for this episode. There are every episode, just about every episode, has some sort of conundrum in it. It has some sort of baffling complexity in it, that the point is to just sit with it and acknowledge it and be comfortable with it to an extent, not necessarily pure, like it's not a like it's going to be okay kind of thing, but it is this is life, and there's also this sort of like, and life is kind of cool, this is what makes life cool kind of component to it. And I think to an extent that is teaching complexity. It is creating some of that curiosity. It's instilling that without sitting down and saying, this is the complexity cartoon where we're going to go through and we're going to talk about, symbolism and pluralism and dynamics and all that kind of stuff. And
we should just make a whole episode where it's all Bluey metaphors. I have to watch more to know, because I don't have kids, but
it's not just for kids. It's one of those, like, this is for adults disguised as a show for kids.
If anyone's listening, I mean, I second Kyle that it's one of those shows, everyone probably knows some kid shows out there where you're like, it's also not really for kids, I mean, it's for both. But
the Muppets.
SpongeBob for a long time. I don't know anymore. It's been a long time since I paid attention to SpongeBob, but when it was first around, I remember being like, whoa. So like the word I like wrote down over here. So like where I think this conversation often goes, and I feel like I'm also trying to keep kind of a mind for what do the kind of folks who might actually listen to this care to hear about, in the sense that it might be affirming for them to hear that you and I have these same thoughts. Mm-hmm. There is this kind of, I don't know if it's a trope, but you learn about complexity science, or you just start to embrace like more of a systems view of things. I feel like the common journey is that we've talked about, first it's, I can see the whole system. I'll just find the leverage point, and then you realize, wait, that's not how it works. Then the next step is to be like, welp, it's just systems are going to system, and I'm inside the system. So I'm going to just like accept it. And, I think Dave Snowden's always talking about this as the lotus eaters, which to a large extent, I agree with Dave on a lot of this, but there's separate stuff there. But, sure, there is this like propensity for certain populations or segments of people to take it just up to the point where they're like, whatever will is que sera, sera, right? And there's a lot of value in that mindset around certain parts of life, right? Like, or, there's the poem, or, give me courage and serenity and all that, right? So like, we're not fighting that per se, but I think there's this very tricky moment, like a knife edge, where you learn what the actual science of complex adaptive systems tell us about the behavior of these systems. And one conclusion is you have to accept the complexity, and that there is no inherent causality that you can read in a system in the moment. And it's really easy to conclude, therefore, I might as well not try to do anything to the system because it will be futile anyway. So I will simply ride the system and float through it. And there is that knife edge in that moment where you can interpret that as the lotus eating, just what will be, will be. Or you can realize that doesn't mean that we can't still stimulate certain things, nudge things. This is not pointed at you, but that I just think that knife edge might be, as we're talking about this, where some of the real tension is for me, even around the ideas of a complexity Bill Nye, because some Bill Nye style writing or engaging of people with complexity can bring them up to that important point where you do have to practice what I would consider, like what some Eastern religions would even say, like radical acceptance is this really important notion. And like learning to sit with discomfort and learning to accept and not try to fight through the uncertainty and the discomfort of ambiguity and la la la. But even in the spiritual traditions that are really big into radical acceptance isn't in the service of radically accept it once and done.
Right.
Radical acceptance is on the step on the way to, as soon as you radically accept something, then it changes. It's like the only way for things to evolve is to radically accept the current state of whatever it is, and then it will keep changing. So there's that moment, or that knife edge, like metaphorically speaking, where I think bringing people or helping people walk up to this point, or just laying the stones for them to follow to this point, and then helping them feel safe enough to like be there and accept it, is really critical. But there is then, I feel like that maybe it's a responsibility that I feel to help people not fall into that place of, well, I guess it means we might as well not try to do anything because complexity is going to complexity. And that is where I feel like the rigor kicks in that I don't see in people who are trying to do the Bill Nye version of things, because they go, just accept and see how it goes. When in reality, somebody who's in, say, a leadership role somewhere, or, has management duties that they're trying to think more smartly about, they need more than the Lego level understanding. They need actual literal practices and tactics. And they're going to be at risk of falling on the wrong side of that knife edge when they are given the Bill Nye version of complexity versus some more advanced version. And I'll stop here. There's one other thing I want to say eventually I wrote down about Bill Nye and the difference between improving people's literacy versus changing their behavior. We'll come back to that though. I can, if there's more you want to say on this. I don't know if anything I said makes sense. This is such
no, it does. And we've talked about the folks selling their complexity frameworks on LinkedIn, and
I'm working on mine right now. It's the Jen Brazzelli CAS framework.
Beautiful. And in just 6 weeks you can solve complexity?
It doesn't have a time limit on it, but it costs $50,000.
Beautiful. That's cheap to solve complexity.
Well, I know. I'm the count little guy.
So, we've talked about a few people that are out there that we've wanted to engage with and do it privately, because people are incented to sell something, differentiate themselves. So they're putting food on the table right now, and so slashing them publicly is not just not in our nature. And so but like the people that are curious, that take us up on some conversations, not that they're not onto something, but like all of us, it's all kind of premature. We're all somewhere in an arc. And I mean, the number of things that I've thrown out there, I think the difference is when we're throwing stuff out there and going, this is where we are in our thinking on this, let's have a conversation. It's a provocation to kind of explore deeper, as opposed to hey, I figured it out. Here's the thing I'm selling. It's packaged. It's ready to go. And then we're beyond conversation. And so I think you're right. That's not what we want to put in front of people. But this is that's the incentives within the system at the moment. So that's a thing we're going to have to live with. But
Yeah.
the other incentive that's out there, the sort of maybe not the exact pull, but the tension on that is that I think more and more we're all becoming aware that the sort of colonial idea of there is just one way, there's one normal, there's one sort of fixed process for life and kids in general, and specifically, here's how we're going to sort of now entrust you with the process that we as adults had. Take this and go be successful with it. Is just not going to work anymore. And so the stuff that we actually have to prepare them for, we have no idea. So we can't do that through any rigidity. We have to do things like say, go find out, go turn over a rock and see what's under it. And when they say, I think it's this, we have to fight the instinct to go, it's not that in every situation. In some cases, absolutely. But also like, I don't know, the world's a little different for the rest of us too. And some of the things that we're carrying aren't necessarily serving us either. And so we need to sit back and rethink some of these. So I think this is a good time for this. And this is a time, it's absolutely a time when it's needed, just because this is a skill. But it's also, I think this is a generation right now that needs to, they're going to figure it out. Whether they're going to figure it out because they get thrown into the fire, literally in some cases, or they're going to figure it out because they were kind of prepared walking into it. It's up to us. But like, this is where we're headed.
All right. You know what? Okay. Crap. I'm like 18.
That takes us down a little bit of a different. We can come back to that.
No, see my mind map here. It's insane. Okay. Well, because I love it. Like, so what you said, like my first instinct is to be like, these processes that we've used, they don't serve us anymore. But like, did they ever? So is anything different, or is it just that we are building a collective consciousness of its not being fit for purpose as a species to engage in ways that we have over the last couple decades, if not centuries? I mean, and ultimately this is kind of just like a semantic history argument. So it's more a rhetorical question, unless you want to answer it. I don't want you to feel like you have to, but like,
no, I think that I've gotten into this one with a few people before, and I think it's good to go back and be critical of all of those things and whether they served us or not. I think that is the point.
Yeah.
But I think it's also okay to say that we go through these cycles of we had all these problems and then we created these great solutions, and now we've realized that all of the solutions we've created are the problems that we're dealing with today.
Yeah,
it doesn't mean that we should have done something different before, because we solved the problems that we had with the resources we had, with the knowledge we had in the moment, in the sort of epistemic paradigm that we were in. Now that has all moved because of the action that we took through that time. And so yes, but also let's also be critical.
Yeah, like that right there, I feel like a million exclamation points, because it's this just eternal process of like moving the goalposts, or the iterative cycle of, learning, reflection, whatever, feedback loops, however you want to talk about it, model it. And I think that maybe people forget, especially when the loops or the cycles are long, that is a continuing process, and that you do once
rapid.
Well, right. I mean, they're either happening so fast you don't see them, or too long you don't see them, and you kind of really forget that like this is all happening at multiple scales, right? Like, so I think that's really key. But like, kind of still looping that back around though to like the nature of how people engage with this, like the purpose you're describing in helping people feel like they can engage with complexity science or complexity-ish stuff. I think about it as like giving people enough of a handhold. They're trying to climb a wall. If it's a smooth wall, they can't get any purchase. So there's got to be some little footholds and handholds, like a climbing wall, or talk about a ladder up to the ivory tower, or whatever metaphors you want. But I wrote down, and then I thought of another thing and I'll pull it in. But like we were talking a little bit earlier, part of what you like to do is like you shared the Cynefin thing a little while ago on LinkedIn, where you were having fun putting imagery from movies into each of the Cynefin
Right.
domains, right? And like I think most people who see those, especially people who know you, they know you're not literally saying, and here is an example of a
Right.
clear from Star Wars and a complicated from Star Wars, but you're kind of just trying to spark. You're holding two electrodes close to each other. They're not
Mm-hmm.
conducting electricity. You're holding them close enough that if somebody comes over and like, oh, something could jump from here to here, like you're maybe in the metaphor, you're one electrode and the other person's here. And if they get close enough, the spark jumps. I don't know.
Right.
Terrible metaphor
Yeah.
day, guys. Sorry. Didn't sleep well last night. But I do think there is something to be said for that style of, this is your version of being Bill Nye, is that you're creating things, or the playlists that you create of things that are just meant to spark, to give an encounter with difference. And that stuff is your version of Bill Nyeing. Let's make Bill Nye a verb. So you're Nyeing
I like that.
complexity science in this way, whereas I might be doing something kind of different, right? Like I
Mm-hmm.
engage in similar activities, but they
Mm-hmm.
whatever the Jen flavor to your Kyle flavor. I like to write
Mm-hmm.
about this stuff where I'm kind of floating in between different levels of abstraction for people, and I like to give visual kind of talks from time to time on this topic, and it's different. But for me, the most important one of all is one that isn't always visible to the public, because it's when I'm engaged in client or other kind of internal collaborations with people, where I'm just facilitating a process or a workshop, so there's nothing tangible. But I'm doing my version of Bill Nye because I also taught for so long that I was like an honorary Bill Nye in my own brain from the first day I was a physics teacher, right? So
Right.
I like this as an illustration of the many ways you can Bill Nye complexity if what you're doing is truly, at the end of the day, trying to facilitate the aha or the spark or the encounter with difference, rather than simply trying to explain, which is, I think, maybe that tempting but like bad misstep that we see. And this all reminded me that we have a sticky in our Miro board. And this
Mm-hmm.
comes back to the thing you were just saying too about the value of complexity for people, especially now in these trying times or whatever, which
Mm-hmm.
I still want to, I'm loath
Right.
to like accept as a concept, but that's my own hang up. But the sticky that I had remember putting in here was complexity as noun versus adjective versus verb versus science. And like if
Mm.
complexity is a noun, what is it? It's thinking about the actual characteristic of, or like innate somethingness of a system that makes it complex and adaptive, right? So like there's a noun form of complexity that we talk about a lot, but there's also this adjective that we use to say that something is complex. And like, what is complexity, the noun that we all bat around, and I think on LinkedIn we're just throwing it around like a frisbee these days, versus using complex as an adjective to describe a dynamic or describe a system's behavior. And then compare that on top of that to like I wrote in here, verb and adverb, right? Like complexity as a verb. What is complexitying, right? Is it the science, like the study of complex adaptive systems? And last but not least, the reason I thought about this is because you were talking about right now, if people's engagement with complexity science and adjacent things is that it helps them figure out how to accept the complexity nounness of what they
Mm-hmm.
are finding themselves in, then what they are doing kind of almost has this adverby kind of feel to it. Sorry to those who are like, I fucking hate English grammar. But like an
Yeah.
adverb is a word that modifies another verb or a noun, right? Or adjective rather.
Mm-hmm.
So like it's just this extra modifier on things. And I am really finding it funny that we didn't even intend to, but where I think you were just at kind of came back around to this. We very easily, I think, mix up, even talking about Bill Nye. Are we talking about Bill Nye for complexity, the noun, the field? Are we talking about Bill Nye for
Mm.
the verb of how you might engage with the complexity of something? etc. So I have opened up a can of worms, and I am both sorry, not sorry.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. I've never really broken them down between verb and noun. When I hear you say noun, I hear you say, what is the ontology of complexity?
Yeah.
Okay.
I've literally never thought
I
about this till right now. When I wrote it on the Miro,
okay.
it was in response to something we'd talked about. I absolutely do not really think you and I would benefit from a typology or categorization of complexity into these particles and
Well,
streams. But
I think Prigogine wrote like the 10
yes,
characteristics of a complex system that
right,
I think is fine. And
right,
I can read that now and go, this, it adds up. It's great. If I had read it 20 years ago, I'd say, well, this is interesting, but I think it's one of those things that would have to materialize for me in another way for me to
yeah,
go, now it lands for me.
yeah. But I think your point about
There's nothing.
ontology versus other things. So it probably, this might just also be a very like pedestrian or confusing and not really useful way of confusing the notion of like ontology versus epistemology versus, you know, the phenomenology of complexity.
Mhm.
Like probably when I just was walking through all that, some of our listeners were like, Jen, just use the right term. But it's more about, you know, it's also not about these are the defining characteristics, you know, or these are the
Mhm.
criteria, you know, this is necessary but not sufficient. You need some combination of these for you to like check the box and be complexity. It is more about for a human, how are we Bill Nyeing complexity?
Right.
Can be Bill Nyeing about the behavior of complex systems, which to me is more like nouny, or it could be
Mhm.
the Bill Nyeing of how humans engage in complexity and thrive in it or find themselves in it, which is more of like a verb, you know? So am I Bill Nyeing about what something is? Maybe you say
Mhm.
ontologically, or am I Bill Nyeing about how we interact, like Nora Bates and Samathesy style, you know, learn
Mhm.
and change in response to each other? Maybe that's somewhere in the phenomenology, you know, like it's anyway.
I no, you're onto something because I think it's good to make that distinction, but I think that's where that right level of contextualizing is. Because when I um going back to Mr. Wizard,
I
it
thought you
was
were saying
more I
Bluey.
think
You should
Bluey.
go back. Go ahead.
Bluey is not the ontology of any of these
Oh, of
things,
course not.
and that's fine. And that's I mean, it's impactful as an adult watching it. The
Yeah,
kids are getting it at a different level,
yeah.
and kids at different ages are getting it. My between 6 and 4, they're getting it at receiving slightly different things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, excuse me. I think the where it starts to transition into more of the ontology is where that contextualizing is important, where the not yet is important. Because when we think about how we do this, we've talked about this. We talk about it all the time. A lot of what we're doing with our clients is really just giving permission to step outside of the certainty that's getting demanded of them, or the sort of the expectation that things are supposed to be causal and linear. And we can kind of explain confidently. And the reason we can explain confidently is because we understand the ontology of these things and we understand more of the deep science of these things. So that's important in the confidence. Like I always say, there's an intuition to this, but I'm acknowledging more and more that the confidence doesn't come from the intuition. The confidence comes from the actual, like, deep knowledge of this. So uh, it took me a few minutes, but I'm there. The intuition is still important. The intuition is there's a lot of fuel in that. So I'm not diminishing that. I'm
Yep.
piling on
Mm-hmm.
the but that permission to say it's not the one thing. And where was I going with that? With the way that I think this is important in the way that we can talk about it with kids, and the way that we're in this space I was talking about before, which we can argue about, and maybe we need a whole different episode for that. I don't know that it's an argument necessarily, but whether or not we're in trying times, but the I think we've always needed the ability to adapt. And so the getting to just that point, that permission to say, yes, things are different. Yes, things are complex. Yes, things are uncertain. Go with it is that's nothing new. I don't think that's anything that anybody wasn't doing when, like, again, we grew up on Jim Henson, and there was a lot of like the curiosity and the fun and that sort of stuff too, that just said like, be weird, it's fine.
Yeah.
um and the sarcasm in that, and the non sequitur stuff in that was just, I don't know if it was apparent to me as a kid, but it certainly strung along. um I don't know that I would go back to that and say this is a good example of complexity and show something from the Muppet Show, but something stuck because
Yeah.
here we are. But at the same time, I think what you're on to. Maybe I'm starting to ramble here a little bit, but the verb of complexity, I think, is that part that's still really important, that you can then tag on, and this is what I do with a lot of my presentations, is in the appendix, there are a whole bunch of links afterwards if you want to get into the
Mhm.
math on this. Here it is. But just for our purposes, trust me when I say people are looking at the same thing. They're looking at the 6 and the 9 from opposite angles, and they're arguing over whether or not it's a 6 or a 9, and the answer is it's both.
Yeah.
And that's really the point of it. As long as you can kind of conceptualize that for a moment, have that aha by experiencing that, then that's, if you want to go deeper, there's more. If
Yeah.
not, that's a great end to a chapter.
I'm glad you brought up the 6-9 example, because I think it is a really good illustration. If somebody's like watching this and doesn't know what we're talking about, you can just Google it. But it's, if two people if a 6 is painted on the ground and one person stands on one side, one stands on the other, they both see different things. What they both see is technically accurate. But what I like about that example is that when people spend too much time with it, they create all these like extra things around it that I think are really relevant to this conversation. So I think you and I both operate from a sort of shared foundation on everything you just said, which we should just clip and like put on its own little thing because it was perfect. But I also think when people make a point like, well, what if the person who painted it minted as a 9? What does that matter? Does that matter? And in what way? Or how where does that fit in the equation? What about this was a 6 and it had the little dot to indicate the 6, but that dot's been concealed or washed away? What does that mean over time? Like the change in the evolution of what this thing's original beingness was. This gets like super, why are we being so weird about it? But I like all that because everything we're talking about points to what you've said about giving people permission to accept that there are pluralities that we simply have to work with. You cannot always collapse the possibility or, what is reality kind of space down in. We're all operating like, Schrodinger's reality at points with this stuff. But there are also aspects, not of just life, but also even the nature of complex systems that aren't 6 or 9. They are one or the other. And we do know certain aspects of behavior that are like both empirically, like, naturalistically, observably, however, you want to adverb it up, confirmable as either this or that, and not just in like, after the fact kind of post hoc rationalization or whatever. And so the reason I'm calling this up is because this is where, and this whole noun, verb, adverb thing, again, I really hope nobody takes that and runs with it, because I think that's kind of dumb, honestly. But I like where we're going. It's helping me in this conversation kind of understand even where folks like me and you are not on the same playing field around what we'd want a Bill Nye of complexity to do. Because it is different to do it around just understanding that there really are lots more scenarios in our lives where it's the 6-9 thing. And I think that is really important in and of itself. But that there are also other aspects of things, maybe in the ontology sense, where it is one or the other. You're looking at it from the wrong side. Like there's stuff like that. So there's something rich in maybe, I think, just for me thinking through that notion of the Bill Nyeing of complexity in and of itself is actually going to be operating at different, maybe it's parts of speech, or maybe it's Stacy's, you know, if you want to think about that, you know, there's the, what is it doing? What is, you know, is it, there's a value judgment. Like there's a Bill Nyeing of this that even itself is happening like multi-scale. So I'd never really bothered to kind of interrogate that at all. And it's interesting to think where that would go if I spent more time with it.
This is interesting. And tell me if I'm getting this wrong, because here's what I heard. There's this three-way fork that you run into that either says we're going to find this sort of like colonial normative one-way sort of thing, or we're going to we're going to discover what incompressibility actually is by experiencing it, or we're going to eat a lotus. We're just going to go. It's there. It is.
I mean, it's probably all three. You know that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's. It's fun to even, you know what when you were describing it, you know what I thought of was like that imaginary object that can't exist in the real world that like has three prongs on it, but like one of them, you know, like
yes.
that is this. So it's those things, but it can't be any of them actually. It's all of them.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay, but I was looking at my little slip of paper too as we were just chatting. Because I feel like honestly we should just like cut the episode right there, because I feel like that for me anyway was an interesting looking at it from all the angles. But since we're still on Bill Nye, very briefly, and then I'm sure we can think of other things to jump to. But I mentioned earlier too, there's something about Bill Nye and his career that I actually think is an interesting parallel with complexity too. And that is, for those who don't know, you know, Bill Nye's career actually he's a scientist by training. I think he majored in engineering, maybe mechanical engineering, and he was a Boeing engineer for many, many years. He's like a patent for a part for the 747. That was like all the kinds of cool things in his history. Like I say all that, not because we care so much about pedigree or whatever, but like real deal in that he understood it deeply. Okay.
Right.
Beyond the Lego level. And so that's what makes it to me different than when somebody reads a book, a popular book about complexity science, and now themselves are out trying to be the Bill Nye of complexity. So there's something there. And for me, that is not about, you could say that and you could hear that I'm like giving more credence to certain types of training or knowledge. And that is not it. It's less about having some level of like epistemic gatekeeping. It's actually for me more about epistemic trust. I have trust for the rigor of someone like Bill Nye's knowledge of physics. He had to go through physics all the way to the other side of expertise to be able to come back around again and then make it accessible. And at least in my experience, that's been true for most of the examples that we're talking about here and others, Mr. Wizard and others like, you know, Alton Brown. Folks had to really engage and study at a deep level. And it didn't have to be book learning and school learning. I just mean they had to engage so deeply that they themselves, you know, had that level of really high definition rigor. Only then can you then bring it back to a place that is accessible for others. And I have found that to be true in my own career as an educator. Forget about complexity science. It was true with physics, and it's so, et cetera. That said, it's not about the training. It's just knowing whether somebody has that, to me, has always been, it's not that I need to know it to trust them. If you had never told me what Bill Nye's background ever was, I didn't need to know it. It was, I could see it present in what he was doing. So that is the other sort of source of itchiness for me here, is that I think there simply just are not yet enough people, because it's a nascent field still, you know, that have been so immersed and in so much depth into the field. And most people are still coming from like certain angles into it. So they're bringing like a biological lens or an anthropological lens or an information theory lens or whatever lens. So that's the challenge for me. And it might be why we have not yet seen the Bill Nye of complexity, because I don't know if any one person has really got the depth. There's a lot of people who have the depth, but they themselves haven't, you know, been able to then come back around and be that Bill Nye as easily as someone who's read one book about it and is out there making like, you know, Instagram posts about it. But the reason I bring it back up again, though, that was a bit of an on-ramp to this. Everything I just said about Bill Nye, this glowing praise about the rigor of his understanding and how that makes what he does so possible, it was all about stoking the curiosity, like we said, right? And probably to some extent, he would say also raising literacy, the science literacy, right? Which gives you tools and skills, right? Later, he got into stuff around science denial and misinformation and stuff. And he did like a debate. I forget who now it was even with. Like, he was a really good example of someone who, I don't want to be like should have stayed in his lane, but when he was going to do these debates with this like famous science denier, and this is how much it registers for me because I don't even remember who the guy was or what it was all about. I remember thinking that's too bad, because just building literacy isn't going to cut it. And facts are not what change people's minds or behavior. And there are a lot of humans out there who know this really well from their work and their studies in social sciences and decision science, right? And behavior science. But Bill Nye, who was an expert in science communication for certain populations and audiences, didn't know or understand that. And so basically agreed to get roped into this kind of like circus around, we're going to have a debate. And I'm going to debate through dialectic, to a point where people are going to say, wow, science wins. I'm going to stop denying science. And I'm telling this story because I can see parallels in the assumptions people make about complexity science and how others can engage with it and should engage with it. I think that, once again, the difference between explaining versus facilitating learning and curiosity is an important distinction. And I think the difference between building literacy and inviting people to engage or behave differently are two different things. And I think in complexity, asking someone to come on over and, get to know these ideas a little bit is still very different from, now that you see things this way, you're going to behave or choose differently or manage or lead differently. There's a leap there that I don't think there's a bridge, at least not in the way people assume there is. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's my other.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. And there has to, I wonder what that intersection was for Bill Nye. That, I mean, knowing that he needs that curiosity, but to be able to like make that leap from I'm inventing stuff for Boeing to I'm going to put on the bow tie and play this character.
Yeah.
Which I've seen him not in that character. It's still very genuine, but it's still like now I got to like be in front of kids, and it's very different. It's interesting. What you reminded me of was two things. One followed the other immediately. I had a friend whose father was on trial for medical malpractice, and they had to sit through all like days and weeks of court, and everything that was being like presented was in this heavy medical text, and there's the jury, and there's somebody in there trying to interpret for the audience, and they're just like, and he ended up being convicted, and the question afterwards was like, how do you even have the capacity, when we say jury of your peers, how do you have the capacity to call them peers when you're speaking a completely different language to people? And they couldn't really do it.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of the Challenger investigation afterwards, and it was Richard Feynman, right? That who did the like they were just running around in circles for a long time, and he finally took the O-ring and stuck it in a glass of ice water and dropped it, and basically it just took that small gesture to kind of sit like eared it like so. He
made so many enemies when he did that.
Yeah.
That's, I think, an important piece to that, which carry on, but connect that to the dots we're connecting here.
The art is in that ability to get out of your own head and out of your own the water we're swimming in, and to be able to traverse into another space, to have another conversation altogether. And so it's not that's not part of the curriculum for we're going to learn any of these one things. Yeah. And this is where generalists are really valuable in this world.
Yeah.
Is that ability to interpret.
Yeah.
But it's also like, where did we come from, and what are the things we're tripping over, and what are these weird and serendipitous intersections that we're finding that bring us to this place to connect these two dots that created a new novel thing.
I love this because what you're talking about is also reminding me of, well, like, for example, you mentioned like Bill Nye and Richard Feynman are two of my heroes, you know? I mean, there's what it was that sparked Bill Nye to put the bow tie on and like actually do a program for kids. You know, how Alton Brown got into television was that he was actually already kind of in television, or he was in some other kind of like video work and got interested in why it was hard to explain the science and went and learned the science and then came back and did it. But in all these cases, and Feynman's such a good one, everything you've just said about being willing to walk down the metaphorical hall across the disciplinary silo borders, whatever, we don't teach it. We actively discourage it. You know, that's a whole separate, long, and probably boring conversation for most people at this point. But that piece of like the Feynman example, there's a really good book on, I mean, there's tons of books on it, but there's a really good book on that, on the disaster, on the trial that followed. I can't remember the name, but if folks are actually curious and want to, hit me up and I'll find it. But what always struck me about that was that they didn't want to put him on the stand. They didn't want any of that to be, they didn't want it to be a circus, because just connecting it back to something that people could see with their own eyes and engage with if they didn't have the science background, they just didn't want the quote circus. And the way that what we're talking about, the communicative power of linking from this sciencey stuff to this very human stuff is threatening. It's scary. And I mean, it's really easy to like villainize the people. Like in this case, it was NASA. We all love NASA, but it was NASA, who were like, who's he trying to protect? Self-protection, I get the instinct, but it's easy to villainize the people that are threatened by and want to fight this kind of, knowledge is power or sharing across boundaries or whatever. But at the end of the day, they're terrified because so much of their sense of either identity or ability to make a living or, well-being in general is tied to some of these structures, that it loops right back around again to where if understanding the nature of complexity science helps you loosen your grip on those structures, it helps us all. You know what I mean? That, not that like teaching NASA about complexity science around the Challenger explosion would have changed any of this, but I just find an interesting little loop there that I don't know if folks, follow per se, but I think there is an interesting, just because it's also reminding me of like, you mentioned Feynman, that like your people idea, which I don't love in general, but those have been my people my whole life. I've been struck by and found these were my heroes, they found ways not just to be into science or to speak poetically about science, but that they were willing to cross some of those. And in some cases, it was never, I want to build a bridge for others to cross. It was, I'm going to just show you there's a here and there's a there, and you can probably cross it, and there's more or less hand-holding along the way. But I do wonder, what it is that folks have in common that share that, because I felt that innately from my youngest memories. I mean, I wasn't like a 6-year-old being like, I want to be a teacher, but when I first encountered Feynman's writing, I was like, this is one of the very first people I've ever seen describe how he is curious in a way that I felt. And I was like, no longer alone, because I read an autobiography from a dead white guy, and then I went off and found a bunch of other people like that. So all dead. Those are my mentors. So I don't know, like, what is it about, it goes back to the question of what's innate versus what's encouraged. And my parents, despite me growing up in a very typical American school district, somehow must have made it feel like it was safe and desirable for me to cross a bunch of disciplinary boundaries. But how do we help people do that with or without complexity science, even part of the conversation,
Ooh. That's one of the questions I was hoping we would trip over. Not that I knew that question, but like, I hope we find a new question, because we're not just going to find the Bill Nye the complexity guy through impatience or frustration, or absence.
If there was going to be a Bill Nye for science, for complexity science, he would already be out there.
Right.
It's a new field, but it's not that new. So, yeah.
I don't, and it won't. Like I said, it won't be like Bluey. It won't be explicit. I don't think,
Yeah.
and it doesn't have to be.
Yeah.
Like somebody just being able to, like, I mean, Mr. Rogers talked about comfort with plurality,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
there were plenty of people that even Sesame Street did this sort of stuff. There was a lot of this that's embedded in a lot of um, like pushing curiosity, like instilling curiosity in kids isn't something that is like again a new concept. But I think yes, the verb and the noun is clunky for this conversation. It works great to facilitate this. It's a sense making mechanism. It works great. Um,
It's
it,
generous.
it's it, it's a caricature for the moment, and that's all. That's all a lot of our sense making stuff is supposed to be.
That's right. That's
So,
right.
so it's the introducing that noun. I think is the thing that hasn't happened yet.
Yeah.
And I think where I started this conversation was we need the verb. We need lots of the verb. And as we've talked about it more, we've had the verb for a long time, and there's a big investment in the verb, and the verb is good. But the noun needs to start to creep at the right time in the right place. And you're right, we can't just have like the charlatans, because how many self-help gurus and like Dr. Phil's are there out there in the world that are just have their knees cut down by actual professionals out there that are recognizing the harm that people are doing by just capitalizing on vulnerable audiences. So it needs to be somebody that is legit, that suddenly turns around and says, I don't necessarily want to be lecturing anymore on this. I want to be like sitting in front of the fireplace and, doing something different. Change the whole persona of the conversation from patents at Boeing to the bow tie.
I mean, what's coming to mind though as you talk about this. You and I keep talking about like a guy for like a field or whatever, like one person.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think to myself, does every field have a Bill Nye? No. Mm-hmm. Why is it that we talk about people like Bill Nye or what's the other big one from that era? I forget his name now. Neil something.
Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Yeah, from PBS.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And notice how this kind of tied to what I said earlier, but they became increasingly politicized. So there's something there to take note of. But Hank Green today, I think, is like the modern sort of version. Very accessible, very awesome dude. All of these, even Alton Brown, even though it was food science.
Sure.
There
Steve Irwin.
Yeah, and all of these are, and I'm not focusing on the gender. I hope that I probably hinted at that. I'm like,
Right.
but they're all science.
You're from the Northeast. Guy is gender neutral.
Guys. Yeah, guys.
Right.
Science. It's all science, even whether it's biology, whether it's animal science, whether it's why are we not so like the Bill Nye of history, the Bill Nye of art, who's the Bill Nye of math? So there are people out there that you could answer each of those with. Don't get me wrong, but do any of them
Bob
have
Ross.
yeah, that's good. But like that's kind of it, right? So what is it about particular fields or practices or activities? Is it science as a like field of study that seems to generate this because of this notion that it's hard or it's inaccessible or it's esoteric? Or is it just because there's something about how we all make sense in the world together that we don't really see that we are ourselves scientists like the day we're born? Like, what is it about science that has to generate Bill Nyes in a way that some other fields don't have to?
Hmm.
Or is it like the reverse problem is that we have decided science is important? It's STEM, it's innovation, it's how we, as a species, we've made our tools and we've studied the world with our magnifying glass. And so we study the world to remake it, and there's like this, is it a function of the like post mid-century thing that generated the Bill
Hmm.
Nye dynamic, and that you and I even sitting here today talking about Bill Nye is itself this weird symptom of a system that we're both talking about, hoping it continues to evolve away from us anyway. So like, you know, fuck a Bill Nye. Maybe the answer is it's like, what's the distributed version of Bill Nye?
Sure.
Instead of a leader, you have distributed leadership. Instead of a decision, distributed decision making. Instead of a intelligence in a brain, you have distributed cognition and collective intelligence. What is a distributed collective Bill Nye in a complex adaptive system? That's a way more interesting question. And I don't have an answer, but
No, I can think of a couple of examples and other concepts. Back to science, like Lego has their robotics teams, and so it's not one person that drives that,
yeah,
but like a ton of kids around here, and so I'm waiting for my oldest to see if he's interested. But like, yeah, go build robots out of Legos and learn how to program Arduino and this sort of
yeah,
stuff, and they're doing competitions with it. It's not one person driving it, but it's made it accessible at that same level, and it's sort of driven by individual coaches in local places.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
School of Rock is another good example where that happens with music. Um, the things that my kids do, the CrossFit for toddlers, the Kid Strong, what it's
mm-hmm.
called,
Yep,
like fitness. Let's make fitness fun for kids, like that kind of stuff. So it's there and it's distributed, and those are
yep,
individuals that rather than having a PBS show, have a couple classes in a strip mall that, maybe their entire audience is 200 kids every year, but
yep.
that's
Perfect.
the impact they're making, and it worked. And there's one here, and there's another one in Raleigh, and there's another one down the road in Atlanta, and whatever else. But like,
Perfect example.
yeah.
However, what occurs to me is all the examples you just gave are what we in the teaching biz would say are supplementals. It's gym class, art class, Lego
uh
class. I'm just joking with you. Music class.
yeah.
But I am noticing that those were the closest to hand for you. And they're probably, because those were the kind of things I would probably think of first too. There's
Hmm.
investment in, or there's business opportunity in those existing as distributed, local, context oriented things instead of a
Hmm.
PBS show with like one guy. Probably because they're considered supplemental and not core to whatever, the education process is. So I just find that kind of rich too. Um, while we're at it really quick, just
Yeah.
because I kind of also heard, so at some point in our conversation, we've kind of danced around like science versus maybe like aesthetic or art, or, the notion of like a science or mathy versus a more poetic.
Mm-hmm.
You and I have had some chats about this, not here yet. And I wonder if this is
Yep.
a bit of an intersection because
Let's do it.
I okay, because this all started with our complexity lounge chat. And in that lounge chat, I think you on that day made reference to the scene in Contact, right? Where
Yes.
he says they should have said a poet, sent a poet. Because she's
Hmm.
overwhelmed, she's breathtaken, she's finding this
Yeah.
so incredibly compelling and existentially meaningful. And, whatever she's like,
She's
I don't have
narrating
words.
for this recording what
Yeah,
she's seeing, and she can't find the words to
doesn't have
describe this
words.
galaxy
You should have
she's
said a
approaching.
poet. And you get, so this is me like both calling you out and being like, sir, I disagree, because you basically said something. I'm putting words in your mouth from memory, so you can correct. But it was
Hmm.
basically in response to something else we were all talking about, and the notion was that there is this kind of fundamental difference or divide between science or scientific communication or scientific ways of knowing and describing and sense making versus artistic or poetic or lyrical, or all the implied adjectives that you could sticky around each of these. And when
Hmm.
you said it, I didn't want to grab it and go off in that direction at the time, but like I stood there and I
Hmm.
was just like, I totally fucking disagree, because I know that's a
Good.
scene in a movie written by a bunch of
Right.
people who probably feel that
Hmm.
way, but you know I think that science and poetry are not actually separate at all. And you and I think, have had different experiences in this way. I grew up as a kid who felt like science was just fucking beautiful. I hung the
Mm-hmm.
periodic table in my bedroom like a poster because I thought it was the
Sure.
most incredible work of art. And later on, I became enamored with information like data visualization, and like you wonder why. But like, I think not just the argument that like a lot of scientists are also poets or can write beautifully. I mean, that's one piece of evidence, but I actually think these are all actually the same phenomenon. I think the phenomenon of that deep moment or ongoing living experience that is just in like complete awe, whether it is art or a scientific epiphany, or I think like humor and comedy fall into this kind of place as well. And this is
Mm-hmm.
actually reminding me something that Arthur Kessler writes about, but I'm curious, we can come back to that if we need to.
Yeah.
I want to hear your response to this because I think
Yeah.
you have had a different experience with these things where they are more
Yeah.
separate.
So I'll start by saying there's not an explicit divide where you don't a scientist doesn't have the capacity to also be a poet. That's absolutely true. Um, I think in the movie she was referencing the fact that she's not a poet, and I was in that conversation saying that we need both of those things because both are important to describe the things that we're experiencing and to make sense of the things we're trying to learn here, and that they will resonate in different ways. And for me, I resonate with things that are more abstract, more um, more to me. I guess when I was about to say visual, but I don't know that that's not going to make any sense. If you're hanging the periodic table on the wall, then that's not the visual that I mean. The visual I mean is more like the language like of a Leonard Cohen or like an Auden or something
Why are
like
they different?
that. Well, they're definitely different. There's a how much subjectivity do you find in the periodic table?
Tons.
Really?
Yeah.
So say more about that.
So yeah, I'm really intrigued by this. I think saying abstract earlier is probably something.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the visual periodic table is a literal table with a bunch of cells,
Mm-hmm.
and the intersection of rows and columns tell you something meaningful, and the
Mm-hmm.
numbers that are sitting inside of each of those cells tell you something meaningful. But
Mm-hmm.
maybe to draw on a metaphor that isn't a metaphor, that's just the stuff, the data. There is a
Mm-hmm.
shit ton of warm data that is built into what is implied by the arrangement of the periodic table around
Mm-hmm.
how those things relate to each other.
Mm-hmm.
So seeing the periodic table on the wall is surely, a concrete visual representation of data that can be used as a tool, but it is also this visual culmination or synthesis of a lot of intangible things that are not visible in that actual table, but that are part of its synthesis that are now packed into its existence. And this is where I'm like, oh my God, I want to take you through the history of its development. I want to talk to you about the ways that it was
Mm-hmm.
constructed, and it wasn't like somebody just sat down, and it wasn't like, whatever. And you know that much, I'm
Right.
sure, but I'm not going to do that. But like, to answer the
Right.
question of why that image to me is not just concrete, there is an abstractness to it that just simply isn't visualized there. I have access to that, and I experience an abstract beauty in the periodic table
Mm-hmm.
that maybe you or another person might not, just because there's probably something in my engagement with it, or somebody else has
Yep.
showed me that, somebody else has walked me up to that, someone Bill Nyed it for me, right?
Right.
So
Yep.
there is that aspect that is true about the periodic table that I also think is true about many other scientific forms of information that I don't think get enough respect for being as abstract and meaningful and, yes, subjective as
Mm-hmm.
they really are, partly because that field also is kind of forced to pretend it's not subjective, and therefore have to kind of like hide that stuff away. But
Right.
I don't know. Does that answer? I mean, keep going. Keep going.
It does, and so I'll kind of bring this back to my journey into complexity science. Is it never started with anything like network dynamics or anything like this, or it never started with chaos theory or it was all. It started with how to it's how do we make music together? How do we like produce something creative as a group of multidisciplined people? And me doing that work early on in my late teens, starting to do that work and running up against the contrast specifically of these are the sort of normal, like now you're in the business corporate world, these are the normal processes for collaboration, and me finding it way too mechanistic and me pushing on that for a long time. And so for me, it was always I needed to experience the thing. I needed to be able to articulate it in a very ephemeral sort of way. That was here's the feeling of it. Here's the way that all the metaphors that are sort of surrounding it, the conflicts and the tensions and the things that are like surprising and emerging in those relationships. And then there was a curiosity as to I wonder what this phenomenon is. And then I was able to start understanding it better, gain the language to talk about it, find that there were patterns in this that made some sense to me.
Where did you do that? Where was the first? So not to be like, okay, where did the complexity science come in? I don't mean it like that, because it was
Mm-hmm.
there all along. But when you say that, sparked my curiosity to kind of look into it and learn about it. What was that? Was it going to the Santa Fe Institute site and doing those tutorials? Like, what was it? Where was the
No,
first time you encountered like the words complexity science?
I don't. It actually, for me, it started a little bit before complexity science. It started with social ecology theory and
Okay.
Jody Ferlizzi.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, so
But
it
we should send
because
you this.
yeah, it was me doing my own like independent whiteboard sort of research at work as I was being pushed to like go figure out why people aren't following the process, and me sitting back and saying because they're not, but that's not a sufficient answer, so let me give you a little bit more, and me just kind of like coming up with my own shit. And
Okay.
then when I had design thinking sort of thrown at me and go be co-creative thrown at me, somehow I tripped over Jody's work and went, this is starting to add up in so many different ways. And then service design showed up, and then it wasn't. Then I found Dave and Snowden and complexity science and all that, and it probably resonated a little bit better because I was a little bit because I had Manila Meadows after that, and there was probably one or two somebody else in there as well, but those were the two prominent ones, and then it was kind of easy after that. But it was always I thought, like you were saying with Feynman, I thought I was alone. It's my whiteboard. It's me going, I'm frustrated
Yeah.
by this.
Yeah.
It doesn't fit. I know it doesn't. I can't sleep until I figure this out. Um, and then I start to like get the whispers of, oh yeah, we've dedicated our entire life to researching this, and here's what we've come up with, and we've run experiments. And I'm going, shit, where have you been my whole life? And once I knew a couple things to search for out there, the whole world started opening up,
Yeah.
and that was it.
Absolutely. We need to start collecting like literally the origin story, not the long one we give in like our intros and not the poetic one, but like the thing, what you just shared.
Mm-hmm.
I've never heard that from you before. You've given me bits of
Mm,
it. I know you've told me
right.
about Jody and other things, but like also side
Mm-hmm.
note, what I'm also hearing is that all roads go back to CMU. Um,
Small plug. Yeah. Okay.
I was kidding, but I think that's
They're also not a sponsor, but they should be.
Lord
Send them an
knows I
invoice to
sponsored them. They owe me. I should be sending them an invoice at this point.
do it.
They got enough of my money. But there's like my entry was math and science. right? But I think your description is potentially more common in style to a lot of the folks you and I engage with on the regular these days,
Yeah.
especially folks who are in design-ish and adjacent fields who are pulling on complexity. And I appreciate this. And the reason I asked it was because, and you and I have talked some bits about this, I think that my entry through science and math and physics and all that is less typical. So I feel like I can kind of understand it less. So it's good for me to hear more from the folks who find complexity through those other places. But when you've said to me in the past, or even the conversation we were just talking about, that like seeing the equations, seeing the, the genetic algorithm stuff, seeing the things that go into, speaking of, like the Santa Fe Institute has their like complexity and explorer online courses, and a lot of them are free and kind of always there. So you can take them self-paced. I think those are really well done. I think they're very well designed. I went through a number of them, like way back when I first, kind of encountered some of this stuff. And there's math. It's mathy. It's like high school math. It's approachable for folks that are interested. And you can skip a lot of that, but like, it's not at all the kind of stuff you and I talk about in these conversations. But for me, encountering someone who put these equations together in an order, it was much like the periodic table in that I don't just see the equations next to each other and then, okay, the implication is complexity. To me, they're baked right in. So there's the same feeling I get if I'm looking at a painting that has just gut punched me because it's so meaningful in some way that is beyond words, that I am like moved to tears by this painting. And I've had that experience with certain works of art. I feel that exact same feeling in my stomach when I see certain things done with math or equations, or when I
Wow.
see certain diagrams with science. And I know that that's not super universal, but that's something that it always kills me when people sort of act like that's not there, because I know that is there for a lot of people who are drawn to science. A lot of scientists and science peers have that same feeling and experience. And when I would be even writing on the board as a physics teacher, and this might be part of synesthesia stuff that's kind of unrelated to this conversation, but like I'd be teaching them something super simple like Newton's, laws, or writing like a basic, the kinematic equations, which are, for science people, like these are not works of art. They're very basic things, but nonetheless, I see them, they have a certain color to them, even if I'm writing in black ink. But more than anything, there is just something there that is as compelling as a beautifully composed piece of music, or, an incredibly, like the gestalt that we talk
Yeah.
about with a visual aesthetic applies with other things too. And that's a side to this stuff that I hear, and I continue to hear, almost like I need an on-ramp to complexity that isn't genetic algorithms or the game of life or equations about, recursive this and biology that and chaos theory and da 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 da. And like, yeah, these were my origins and I loved that stuff. But when I encountered complexity, it was basically like someone saying, hey, all these things you already like, guess what? There's this other thing that like uses all those ingredients. So like you already know
Right.
it. Cool, come check it out, and that was what it was
Yeah.
like for me. But I think that it's kind of almost it's not like I feel like it's unfair that people don't acknowledge that it's just as artistic on the science side as it is on the
Right.
non-science side. Forget it. I don't care about fairness, but it is more that you miss out on a lot and lose out on a lot if you feel that the only human way to engage with complexity is to take an end run around that stuff. Maybe it's not accessible to you right away. But if what you do is say, that stuff doesn't do anything for me, I want to work in the forms of complexity that are more about relational knowing and sociological this and anthropological that, but like, the math, I don't know. You are cutting yourself off from just as much of a depth of that compelling gestalt, meaningful understanding. Maybe you won't experience that. Maybe you won't go, oh my God, it's so beautiful, this equation. But that's the reason I get like selfishly and perhaps like irrationally kind of weird about it, which is why I had the reaction to your when you quoted contact in the session, because I was
Right.
just, what the fuck up, man? Like the equations are poetry. Anyway, but I knew you didn't mean it that way. Like, you know what I mean? So
Good, good, good. This is what this reminded me of is this great conversation. And odd that I remember this, but I'll explain why. So I don't remember. I was making some music metaphor because me, and the person I was talking to said that doesn't mean anything to me. I'm musically anhedonic, and the reason, two reasons. Is first, I'm so glad somebody used anhedonia in like a casual conversation. I
you're
love
like,
that. I've been
nerd.
looking for that for so long. Yeah, like you're my people, dude. The other is, oh, I feel so bad for this person. Like I'm that person that, like, and yeah, you are too. I know, like the goosebumps are happening as I'm listening to music all the time. Like I'm moved by music
Yeah.
nonstop, and
I
like
cry so much now.
yeah, same. Like something 40 and kids, and now I'm just,
Yep.
yeah, on whatever. I fall apart. So, um, but uh, I might be mathematically anhedonic.
That's
Just
okay. That's a good, this is good. I'm glad you're putting it this way. um,
I
but
I get no pleasure from math. It might be like maybe I need to unpack some trauma from
yeah,
my elementary from my school days. But
yeah,
yeah, it might as well be Korean. Like I understand some of those equations. I was watching a what's his name, Krakauer, do a presentation at what was it, Rutgers,
yeah.
like a month or two ago, and he was putting up like I think an equation for emergence, and I was like beside myself. Like this just feels so reductive.
Yeah.
Emergence is something that is like it. Let it be a mystery, dude. Don't put an equation on it. This is shit. Like, if you put an equation on it, why not patent it? So like,
Oh, it's so interesting
that's
to hear that though. So like, well, my dogs are barking like crazy. Is it? Hopefully, it's not too disruptive. Okay.
no, it's not too loud at all.
Because somebody rang the doorbell, and let me see if it's no, just the UPS guy ringing the doorbell, despite the fact that he shouldn't do that.
Right.
So everything you just said though, like probably I would be in that audience going like, oh God, just no. Because for me, and I think that is a good though, like being like mathematically like anhedonic is like kind of the perfect way to think about this, which is I don't think it's a problem that you aren't going to engage with the math the way that I experience it. But I do
Mm-hmm.
think that like to be able to be self-reflective enough to see the difference is really key, because
Mm.
I see those equations as it's not okay, now we're putting a label on it, or we're putting a container around it, or in some way this is going to now mean we can get our arms around it. We've made it explicit, therefore we've like flattened it or whatever. It's more just like a language. If somebody created this incredibly beautiful poem in a language that you don't speak, and if for some reason you can't learn to speak it, or it's not accessible because of like you have to have learned it as a child or whatever, then you're just never really going to be able to access
Mm-hmm.
that thing that was so tied to the structure of that language that it is what it is. But what I would wish, maybe this is kind of what this is making me come around to, is like my wish would be that for people who are in the process of encountering complexity science, and they are finding that they are either in the Kyle or the Jen or other sort of like domain camps here, and they're looking at the other side being like, I don't want the math, or I don't want the science. What do you, or vice versa. I wish that people would like ask themselves, is it because one way simply has more meaning for them, or is it because they've kind of closed themselves off for the potential? Because the only other thing I'll say, and then probably we're getting close to a wrap anyway, but
Mm-hmm.
for you, I know, and you said this now and you said it before, some of it's the math, and it's just seeing the math and the equations just is like, just doesn't do it for you.
Mm-hmm.
But math isn't science. Math is a
Sure.
language. It's a container to
Yep.
put ideas in, right? And hand them from person to person, or whatever, hand them through space and time to people. Like there's a difference. And for me, the science is really what's more compelling. And I say the science, but I mean, it could be writing, it could be illustrations, it could be conceptual representations of the study of the fields of physics and biology and chemistry. And I guess chaos is technically math in a way, so we could maybe come back to this weird abstracted, but the version of math that I like is the kind that is not, just the equations. And it is interesting for me to challenge myself to, on one hand, remember the same thing that I wish other people would remember about equations, which is that, everybody out there might be anhedonic in some form, but in some
Mm-hmm.
way you could also ask, why is that? And is that an always will be true situation? Could you learn to find meaning, and could you learn to feel in that part of your body again
Mm-hmm.
someday? Like, did it come from some early trauma, some equation based trauma? And
Right.
could you heal that trauma? And could you once again someday learn to feel love for those equations, like, I hinted at this, and I thought I would just drop it in here in case the two people listening to this are curious. I mentioned Arthur Kessler in his book Active
Mm-hmm.
Creation. He does talk about some interesting ideas around, like, he talks about bisociation as like the intersection of things. It's neat. I've always liked it. There's people have plenty of problems with him and his writing for various reasons, but he also wrote Goats in the Machine, which is where the concept of holons comes from. And like, anyway, so regardless, he's got this like 3-part kind of like little framework that he talks about. And in that framework, it's funny because earlier when I was talking about stuff, I realized I ended up kind of reproducing his little framework without realizing that was what I was talking about. But he talks about sort of art or lyrical, and then like humor, comedy, like when you hear a pun, like a really good pun, that like, ooh, that thing. And then also
Mm-hmm.
like scientific or like kind of puzzle solving, like kind of epiphanies. And that moment, he calls it like the act of creation, where there's something, an
Mm-hmm.
intersection of something. But he puts those together as in they are the same thing, just with kind of like different shape or form. It isn't,
Mm-hmm.
here's art or lyrical, or here's humor, or here's science. And yes, some people have the capability to have all three. No, they are the same thing.
Oh yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think that is what I feel like I wish more people could engage with. I think it would be really meaningful for people's interest in complexity. That's all.
I read this a long time ago, but and I don't remember what got me into this, but there was a this great paper on this where the sort of source of the why we laugh at things, the like what's the actual response, it is a response to it's a threat resolution
Mm-hmm.
is what it is.
Yeah.
And so the cleverness and the puns is an immediate shift from I'm confused to I figured it out.
Yes.
It's the same as in slapstick when we watch like the bowling ball fall on the Three Stooges heads. It's an immediate shift from saying I'm scared because that should brain somebody to oh, I'm just watching this goofy thing,
Yeah.
and it's fine. And the other one is embarrassment. It's
Mm-hmm.
this sort of like this fear of that could be me. I'm watching Jackass or something stupid,
Yeah.
that could be me. But
Yeah.
then a realization of like this is all intentional. They set themselves up for this.
Yeah. The
But
building and then the release of
that's it.
tension or whatever
And
it is.
it's rapid. It's not one of those necessarily like
Yep.
I gave you a riddle and then you
No,
sat there
no.
and stared at
Yeah.
it for 2 days and then you went, oh, I figured it out. You don't bust out laughing
Yeah.
at that point. It's got to be almost inconceivably rapid.
Yeah. If you've not read Kessler's stuff, you'd like it. You'd like that one. Or even just Google
Okay.
like a simple take of it, because, or even just some of
Mm-hmm.
the imagery, his little like triptych that has the 3. If you like comparing things from across fields and domains, he's got just like a bunch of
Okay.
those, and they're a lot of fun. So maybe we should talk more about
Okay.
that in the future.
Yeah, I'll peek at that.
Yeah.
I did have a question and I lost it because
Uh-huh.
the humor thing hit me.
Is it
Um,
about science, math?
it was
Probably about
it was
complexity.
about the anhedonia
Oh,
and
trauma.
uh, trauma, maybe. But I what was I thinking? I was thinking that um, I remember what it is now. I also I don't want to put art and science or even math and language in separate categories. I know they're fundamentally all the same. I think where this stemmed from was us, and I think we've probably talked about this here a few times, was the listening to Dave Snowden explain complexity versus Nora Bateson explain complexity. And we need both things. And it being more, there are people that a Dave or a Dave Krakauer are going to resonate with because the math and the science and the evidence is there and all the footnotes are there and cool, I can go down all the rabbit holes and that's great and it's very attractive to me. And so it wasn't too mathy, but also Nora just sitting down and saying it's breaking bread with people. And what's loaded in that loaf of bread is, to me, just as impactful and brings it home almost at a slightly deeper level, maybe.
It's funny because I love her too. I know she does not resonate with some people at all. I'm sure you know some people for whom that's true too. People are like, what the fuck is she on about? And I think it's interesting to, and you were saying sort of Dave Snowden and Krakauer, like kind of in a similar place, but actually increasingly, I would kind of almost argue that like Krakauer is the math and science guy. And at this point, in most of the ways Dave Snowden communicates, I think I'd call it more philosophy. I think he's drawing more on philosophy.
Absolutely. Yep.
Than in the ways that he communicates. Again, not his actual work.
I
all of that.
mean but more than as opposed to Nora. Neither of them are the Nora.
What I mean is like I wouldn't even put them at this. I would put them in a triad. And I think that there are also a lot of people who find none of those. None of those three are the Bill Nye.
Oh, sure.
Is my argument. Which is kind of the point is like maybe the Bill Nye is distributed among them. And the whole point is you need to get all of them in the mix plus whatever others. But I especially what I find is that for me, science versus poetry, or, they should have sent a poet, the science versus art poet thing isn't really an accurate overlay for the David Krakauer Nora divide. I don't think of Nora as the poet and Krakauer or Snowden as the scientist. I think if you blur your eyes enough, you could do that and make that distinction. But I don't even think that it's that. I don't think it's that cut and dried. I think Nora's as much scientist. I think Snowden's as much poet. I think that's the challenge for me is this is not a polarity in the way that we love to interrogate polarities and say, why not both? I actually think even the polarity itself is ill-formed. But on that note, I actually got to run soon. So maybe we pause it there. And
that's a good place to stop.
Cool. All right. And I will hit stop and
cool.